Star Wars. You and your children loved it.
In 1977, before the release of Star Wars, 20th Century Fox's Charles Lippincott started to pitch Star Wars to every toy company in town. His hope was that someone would take the gamble in producing toys based on the film. A kind of unheard plan for movies. Toys could get a few good years of sales, but movies, they were seen as just come-and-go art. If things went as history has shown, Star Wars would open, and if it was a hit, it would be out of theaters by the end of the summer and kids would have moved on to the next big thing before any toy company could even get toys to the market. At best, toy companies could hope for a short success a year after release if the movie was re-released or ended up on television.
You've never seen anything like it in your life.
Enter the wonderful world of Dr. Dolittle.
A line of movie toys had been done before. In 1967, Mattel gambled on 300 different types of toys based on the film Dr. Dolittle. $200 million of its merchandise went unsold. From games to talking dolls, the line failed at toy stores and proved to the toy companies what they already knew: movie toys didn't make money. Mego did have some success with its Planet of the Apes action figure line, but that was helped due to a short-lived TV series and a string of sequels. Star Wars was over budget and was thought to be by many the flop of the year. Even if it sold tickets, it couldn't make its money back. So why would toy companies risk making toys to a film that would be long forgotten by Christmas 1977? But Lippincott knew Star Wars was right for toys. Its spaceships, its wacky aliens, the laser sword, it was all perfect for toys. Setting his eyes on Mego, Lippincott set up a meeting to pitch Star Wars to the toy-making company, who let Lippincott know that they couldn't risk making toys based on every fly-by-night science fiction movie that came along. Besides, Mego had just started plans to import a line of science fiction-based toys called Micronauts, and by the end of 1976, it was the leading sales of action figures. Mego didn't need Star Wars.
So you can create your own toys. Micronauts, made of plastic and die-cast metal, each sold separately by Mego.
Unable to reach a deal with Mego, Lippincott headed the toy fair in early 1977. With photos from the film, he talked with every toy company he could. That was until he was asked to leave Toy Fair. However, his pitch did sound good to at least one toy company, the small but successful General Mills-owned toy company Kenner, who was having success with its $6 Million Man action figure line. Kenner's CEO, Bernie Loomis, liked the deal because he was led to believe by Charles Lippincott that Star Wars could possibly become a television series. Without even talking it over with George Lucas, Loomis and Lippincott signed a deal to make 4 action figures and a board game. The deal was signed only a month before the May release of Star Wars. It's been over 40 years and details of that deal still have never been revealed. Even the Kenner design team didn't know the details of the deal, saying they only heard rumors that it was $50 and a handshake. Lucas, who was very busy finishing up the film, was upset at Lippincott after finding out what he was locked down to with Kenner over the toy rights. Lippincott would say years later that Lucas wanted more money, but he didn't understand. No one wanted Star Wars. It was a time when toy companies didn't want to make a deal with movie tie-in toys at all. We were lucky to get any deal, Lippincott said. Of course, after the release of the film, once everyone saw how successful Star Wars was, it was easy to say, they should have done this, they should have held out for a better deal. But at the time, before the release of Star Wars, Lucas Limited and 20th Century Fox got the best deal they could. It was Kenner's deal, or no deal at all.
Star Wars, 1 billion years in the making, and it's coming to your galaxy this summer.
A few months before the release of the film, Lippincott handed over to Kenner the trailer for the film, and the toy designers went wild with what they saw. They couldn't wait to get to work on the toys. A long rumor has said that Loomis asked the head of the design team what size the figure should be, and that designer told him about this size, holding up his fingers a little more than 3 inches. However, this was most likely not the case, as the figure size matched with Mego's Micronauts, the best-selling action figure toy line at the time, and it was also the best size for making vehicles for the Star Wars figures. Kenner and Fox knew by June that it would be impossible to get action figures in the stores by Christmas of 1977. That's when Kenner designer Ed Stepney came up with a crazy plan to release an empty box for $10 and a promise for 4 Star Wars action figures by mail as soon as they were available. The plan was crazy, an empty box, but it paid off as it was one of the biggest selling items for the Christmas season of 1977.
They'll be sent to you at home between February 1st and June 1st. The Star Wars Early Bird Certificate Package, new from Kenner.
Star Wars was a hit, and Kenner and Lucas knew more toys other than action figures would be a success. On top of Lucas's list of Star Wars toys were blasters, the Star Wars laser guns. However, Loomis had put a ban on all toy guns a few years before. He, like many parents, did not like kids running around playing with toy guns, shooting at each other. After all, this was only a few short years after the end of the Vietnam War. Loomis, showing Lucas toy plans for 1978, showed Lucas pictures of an inflatable lightsaber for kids to play with, as it would be safe and didn't really look like a weapon. Not like a gun anyway. Lucas looked over the photos of what was planned and then looked up and asked, "Where are the guns?" Loomis let George Lucas know that Kenner had put a ban on all toy guns, but Lucas kept insisting that they needed a line of toy guns for kids to reenact scenes from the film. Finally, Loomis did agree, and Kenner released 2 different blasters, one based on the Han Solo blaster and another one based on the Stormtrooper blaster. By the end of 1978, Kenner sold over 42 million Star Wars items. Out of that 42 million, 26 million was action figures. By the end of Kenner's Star Wars action figure run in 1985, there were more Star Wars action figures in circulation than U.S. citizens. The action figures were more than just toys. It was a way to satisfy our hunger for Star Wars during the 3-year wait before each film. Thanks to the action figures, Han, Luke, and Leia would have more adventures as they ran from the Empire. And after 1980, there would be even more adventures, as Luke would work alongside his new friend Lando in searching for Han Solo, who was taken away by Boba Fett. Even after the final film in the trilogy, kids could use their figures to help restore freedom to the galaxy after the fall of the Empire. We also love to use the action figures to reenact what we saw in the film, as best that we could remember back in the day before videotapes and DVDs.
And finally this evening, if you don't know what a 100-year-old Wookiee is, he or it is seen here on the left, chances are you're going to find out. Douglas Kiker reports.
Star Wars. It is more than just a successful movie, it is a box office phenomenon.
With Star Wars being a huge success, Lucas knew Star Wars would be more than a movie that would come and go. So by 1978, Lucas started to hand down harder rules for companies that had the right to the Star Wars brand. He didn't want the name Star Wars slapped on anything to make a quick sale. Lucas said the movie was made with care and love, and the merchandise should be also. This led to a banning of a Star Wars set of utility belts released in Canada. Once Lucas found out these were done, he ordered production to be stopped at once. Lucas also banned Star Wars being used to sell any type of drugs or alcohol, so fans hoping to get Star Wars cigarettes or Star Wars beer was out of luck. Lucas would not even allow Star Wars themed vitamins until the 90s, fearing that it might give kids a taste of popping pills. It was up to Lucasfilm's Vice President of Merchandising, Maggie Young, to make sure companies were keeping with the spirit of Star Wars. Lucas told Maggie that if he didn't like something that was being produced with the Star Wars name, that she would hear from him. That kept Maggie watching with sharp eyes on what did and didn't get produced under the name Star Wars. The last thing Maggie wanted was to get a call from Lucas asking about a Star Wars item he saw at a store. Lucas did put his foot down for the first few years when he was pitched plans for a sugar breakfast cereal under the name Star Wars. That was until Kellogg's pitched him a plan for a low-sugar cereal called C-3POs in 1984.
Yeah, the Force is with us.
A delicious part of this nutritious breakfast.
No, of course. How much? Oh, my.
C-3POs, a new force at breakfast.
The attitude we're taking in our planning is that George Lucas has created this marvelous fantasy world, peopled by all kinds of droids and exciting creatures, and we think that it could be another Disney. Maybe 50 years from now, they'll be celebrating R2-D2's 50th anniversary.
Kenner was happy with the success of Star Wars, not only with the sales, but the fact that more movies were planned, and it seemed Star Wars would be around to help them make a lot of money over the next few years. In 1977, Kenner market research found that out of 1,000 children, a third had already seen Star Wars, 15% saw it more than once, and every other kid asked said they hoped to see it. Every kid plays Star Wars, and it wasn't just the kids, adults were into Star Wars also. It was the Beatlemania for movies. No other movie before Star Wars had captured the heart and minds of the American culture. Star Wars was not only at the top of movie charts, it was also at the top of the album chart, single chart, best-selling novel chart, and the top of almost every chart one can think of in 1977. It seemed like nothing could outdo Star Wars, at least until the release of its sequel. But then again, sequels never did as good as the original film, but Star Wars was never one to go along with trends. But before they could release a sequel to Star Wars, many others would try to rip it off, not just at the movie theater, but also at the toy stores.
Our galaxy is split into two warring factions, our own and the one ruled by the evil Count.
They say imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, but does that cover movie studios trying to capitalize on your success to make a quick dollar, or toy companies trying to rake in a few million in sales before you can? With the success of Star Wars, there was one thing everyone knew would happen. There would be a slew of copycats trying to get their millions in the new science fiction craze sweeping across the world. Movie studios were dusting off old space-themed scripts, toy companies were retooling and reusing old alien molds, and on the small tube, production companies were trying to find a weekly supplement for the Star Wars fan to lock onto. And people catching in on Star Wars wasn't just for the film business or toy business. With the Star Wars soundtrack crushing record sales, Mecca decided to mix up the Star Wars craze with the other craze of the late 70s, disco. Their disco Star Wars theme hit the top of the charts, and their disco album, the Star Wars theme and other galactic funk, reached number 1 on the Billboard album charts. On September 21st, 1977, 20th Century Fox signed a deal with Lucas for distribution rights for the sequel to Star Wars. But it wasn't quite the deal 20th Century Fox was hoping for. Out of the first $20 million made from the sequel, Lucas would take 52%, 70% of the next $40 million, and after that Lucas would take 77% of everything the sequel made. Fox wasn't happy with the deal, but they really had no choice, as Lucas was free to sell his sequel to the biggest movie of all times to any other studio. Fox would have to take the deal or lose Star Wars to a rival studio. So they took it, but they were very unhappy with the deal Alan Ladd Jr. made with Lucas. It would end up costing Alan Ladd Jr. his job with Fox. Luckily with Fox, after worries from Bank of America as the budget for the Star Wars sequel rose, Lucas had to give Fox a little higher percent for the sequel, as they had to allow Fox to invest some money into the budget. It wasn't just Fox Lucas had over a barrel. With his new company, Black Falcon Limited, a Lucasfilm company to handle the merchandise rights, they would take 90% of any merchandise sales. From toys to t-shirts to Star Wars bath soap, anything related to Star Wars, 90% would go back into Lucasfilm. This would make Lucas a lot of money if the sequel to Star Wars was a hit, but at this time, sequels were rarely as good or as popular as their first film. In the deal between Lucas and Fox, the movie would be financed by Lucas, not by Fox. If Star Wars 2 was a flop, it would be up to Lucas to repay Bank of America, who would loan the money for the sequel. A lot was riding on the sequel to Star Wars to be just as big or bigger than the first film. However, it would be 3 years before a sequel could make it to the theaters. In that time, a lot of studios would try to take the spotlight away from Star Wars. If just one of them was a better film, it could sink the Star Wars sequel. And what if they were worse? it could sour the audience's appetite for Star Wars, giving them a science fiction burnout before 1980. Even though some of the rip-off movies were already in the planning before the success of Star Wars, it was clear the success of Star Wars helped get those movies on the fast track to being released. One of the first films to hit the US and tried to capture some of the Star Wars magic was actually an Italian film released in 1966 called 2+5. It was redubbed and sold to US theaters under the name Star Pilot. It had little impact on the box office.
That's ridiculous.
If a 60s science fiction film with no special effects wasn't your thing, in October of 1977, the 1974 Russian adult film about 5 sexy females from the planet Venus coming to Earth to bring back sperm was released to the US under the title 2069, A Sex Odyssey.
I buried my career in orbit.
In 1978, Vic Morrow would try to take down Star Wars by playing General Gerardo in Message from Space. By the end of 1978, a lot of Star Wars fans were unable to see Star Wars at their local theater, but they could buy tickets for Star Crash, starring David Hasselhoff, the film about an outlaw smuggler and his companion being hired by the Emperor of the Galaxy, played by Christopher Plummer, to rescue his son. They also had to destroy a secret weapon created by the evil Count Arn.
There is an inexorable force in the cosmos where time and space converge. A place beyond man's vision, but not his reach.
If anyone could take down Star Wars, it was Disney, with their science fiction film, The Black Hole, with a budget that was almost double that of Star Wars. Like Star Wars, it would even have a toy line. Unlike Star Wars, it wasn't a hit. The film and its toy line fell soon after release. Disney even tried to rent the Diecaster film camera that was used for the special effects in Star Wars by Lucasfilm, but Lucasfilm was asking a price too high. Disney seemed to put a lot of time into Black Hole, into everything but the script. The film barely made more than its $20 million budget.
From Earth to the most spectacular adventure in space, Moonraker. It's out of this world.
Even James Bond would try to make money off the success of Star Wars with Moonraker in 1979, and it became the most successful James Bond film of that time. Even by 1980, with the sequel to Star Wars hitting theaters, studios had their rip-off films being released. One of the most infamous was the 1980 film Battle Beyond the Stars, starring Richard Thomas as a young farmer set out to defend his peaceful farm. The movie wasn't a huge success, but it wasn't a bomb either, and over time it's become a cult classic.
The action explodes as the fight for freedom races across the universe.
Get us out of here!
A frightened boy, a last-ditch hero and his alien crew, soaring into battle to save the galaxy.
With Battle Beyond the Stars being a mild hit, its director returned again 3 years later with Space Raiders. To save costs, Richard Corman used special effect footage from his previous film. The movie would have his Han Solo rip-off smuggler named C.F. Hawkins, who most people called Hawk. In the movie, a 10-year-old boy is accidentally kidnapped by a spaceship full of rogue space pirates. It was not a hit. It wasn't even a mild hit. It was a big flop. And it didn't even become a cult classic. It mostly has become forgotten.
He's a stowaway on a stolen ship, 10 years old and 10 million miles from home. Space Raiders, the greatest adventure a kid ever had.
And you can't talk about Star Wars rip-off movies without talking about the 1982 film The Man Who Saved the World, a film that's mostly referred to as Turkish Star Wars. The movie even used unauthorized scenes from Star Wars for its action scenes. Not all science fiction movies in the wake of Star Wars were flops. One of the most successful was from a script written in 1975, 2 years before the release of Star Wars, called Star Beast. It would be renamed and released in 1979 as Alien. When asked if he stole Alien from Star Wars, Dan O'Bannon said He stole it from everybody. He gave credit for his love of science fiction as his muse for writing the screenplay. The film will be produced by 20th Century Fox, who were looking for a science fiction film to hold him over until the release of the Star Wars sequel. The only script Fox had on their desk with a spaceship in it was for Alien, said O'Bannon. To help with promoting the film, director Ridley Scott hired Charles Liptoncock to do what he did for Star Wars with Alien. The film was released on May 25th, 1979, 2 years to the day of Star Wars' release. With an $11 million budget, the film would gross over $200 million. Almost all of the movies trying to cash in on the success of Star Wars were lacking in the special effect department and even more lacking in the story department. None could capture the magic or feel of Star Wars. No one making most of the rip-off movies had the love and passion for it as Lucas did with Star Wars. But it wasn't just studios trying to rip off Star Wars. With Kenner unable to get Star Wars toys to stores by Christmas of 1977, it was a good time for other toy companies to get their space-themed toys to the stores to try to capture some of the Star Wars dollars. There was a handful of toys that tried to cash in quickly on the Star Wars name. One of the most blatant rip-offs of Star Wars was Ideal's Star Team action figure line. However, there was only one that found himself in court being sued by 20th Century Fox, Kenner, and Lucasfilm. That toy line was Space War by the New York toy company Arco. They rushed this cheaply made plastic action figure into stores before Kenner could get anything Star Wars on the shelves. They really didn't look like anything that was planned by Kenner. They really didn't look that much like Star Wars. Kenner, Fox, and Lucasfilm was suing Arco for $1 million in damages, saying they would lose sales with the Star Wars action figure line when it was released due to the Space War figures being already at stores. No money was ever rewarded by the courts, but the court still ruled that Arco had to stop production of their Space War figures. If imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, then what is spoofing?
So he and his parents are going to come down to the detention center and pick it up.
Boy, I'll bet they'll be happy.
Yep, that's what it's all about.
While filmmakers were trying to rip off Star Wars to get some success, others were using their time to show their love for Star Wars by making parodies. The first, and still to this day, probably one of the best, is the 13-minute 1978 short film Hardware Wars. Made in the form of a movie trailer, Aaron Fossilia used household items for his epic space fantasy on a shoestring budget of $8,000. It was released only 18 months after the release of Star Wars. It, like the best of the parodies, is made out of love for the film, and it shows. George Lucas would call it his favorite Star Wars parody of them all, and it would go on to be awarded the 2003 Pioneer Award at Lucasfilm at the official Star Wars Film Award.
Golly!
Not only was Lucas a fan, but also was a lot of the crew behind the scenes of Star Wars. This caused the filmmaker Aaron to become an official part of Star Wars, as he was asked by Star Wars sound designer Ben Burr to provide the voice of the Rancor Keeper as he cries in Return of the Jedi. Aaron would go on to add his voice to many other Lucasfilm projects, including voicing Pogler in Attack of the Clones, and 2 aircraft pilots in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. One of his most famous roles, not by Lucasfilm, was being the voice of the Martians in Tim Burton's Mars Attack. Aaron would do more than just voice work for films, as he was the co-writer for the song of Max Rebo's band. His parody, Hardware Wars, was in heavy rotation on HBO in the early 80s. Before most fans could rewatch Star Wars over and over again, Hardware Wars helped fill that Star Wars fans' need for many years. It was seen with the success of Hardware Wars, fans would be hammered with Star Wars parodies throughout the 80s. While most of the young fans would make their own Star Wars parodies with friends after school, it wasn't until 1997, 20 years after Star Wars, that fans got yet another great parody. This This one mixed Star Wars with the highly successful television show Cops. It debuted at Comic-Con in 1997, months after the release of the Star Wars Special Editions. Although Hardware Wars was the first successful parody 20 years before, Troops is seen as the fan-made parody that opened the floodgates for fan parodies. Released during the early days of the internet, when just sharing a few second video would take hours, Troops was traded around Star Wars message boards and Movie Geek site. In a Reddit AMA, the film creator, Kevin Rubio, said that Lucas told him that Troops was part of the official Star Wars canon. With the rise of YouTube, where fans could easily share their homemade videos, hundreds of Star Wars parodies started to pop up. As home computers got better, the fan films got a lot better also. So much better that a kid on his computer could make special effects for his fan film that was on par with the special effects used in 1977 for Star Wars. This helped the fans move away from just doing low-budget comedy parodies of Star Wars. They were now making full Star Wars fan films, telling their own Star Wars stories and sharing them with millions of other Star Wars fans.
Once we kidnap the princess, we can force her father, King Roland, to give us the combination to the air shield, thereby destroying planet Druidia and saving planet Spaceball. Everybody got that?
But parodies of Star Wars wasn't limited to just small, independent short films. The biggest and most famous was released in the movie theaters in 1987, 10 years after Star Wars. The Mel Brooks comedy would poke fun at many science fiction films, but it parodied Star Wars in almost every scene. The film, on a $22 million budget, would make $38 million, a number that was a lot less than most of the Mel Brooks films before 1987. However, since its release, it's become one of Mel Brooks' most popular and loved films. Some even call it the last great Mel Brooks comedy.
I am the keeper of a greater magic.
The Force?
No, the Schwartz.
We're Darth Vader's raiders and we can't believe the things that you do.
Parodies also wasn't just limited to the films. Even musicians got into the act, showing their love for Star Wars. As far back as 1977, there were a slew of musical released albums that were a love letter to the film. There was Chewie the Wookiee Rookie from a rock band called the Rebel Force Band that made an entire album of Star Wars based songs called Living in These Star Wars. Weird Al Yankovic would record 2 Star Wars songs. In 1985, he recorded the very funny song all about everyone's favorite green alien, Yoda.
Yo, 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 Yoda. Yo, 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 Yoda.
And he would return to the Star Wars universe again in 1999, taking the song American Pie and flipping the story to fit the Phantom Menace in his song, The Saga Begins.
A long, long time ago, in a galaxy far away, Naboo was under an attack.
In 1984, Supernova song about Chewbacca, called Chewbacca, would become a cult classic among Star Wars fans when it appeared in the Kevin Smith independent film Clerks. And MC Chris would rap about everyone's favorite bounty hunter with Fet's Vet.
My backpacks got jets. Well, I'm Boba, the Fett. Well, I bounty hunt for Jabba Hutt to finance my vet. Hanging out down the street.
The small screen also found its way to pay homage to Star Wars with parodies. That 70s Show, a show in the early 2000s set during the late 70s, knew almost from the start that they would have to tackle Star Wars, as it was such a huge part of teenagers' life at the time. So for the 20th episode, the gang went to see Star Wars, and they then became obsessed with the film. If you were doing a TV show about kids during the time period of the original Star Wars films, it would have been a disservice not to at least throw in Star Wars references here and there, if you wanted to capture the feel of the time period. Freaks and Geeks, set during the 1980-1981 school year, would drop many Star Wars references during the first and only season.
She's a cheerleader. You've seen Star Wars 27 times. Do the math.
There would have been no way to portray young teenage geeks without them dropping Star Wars references time to time. Taking a love for action figures and Star Wars, Robot Chicken creator Seth Green would have many skits during his show that would parody Star Wars, and would even go on to do entire episodes all related to Star Wars. But probably the best of all the small screen Star Wars parodies came in 2007, when Fox aired the 1-hour Family Guy episode, Blue Harvest. In this episode, we see the story of Star Wars retold with the cast of the animated show. Any Star Wars fan watching could tell almost from the start this was done out of love and respect for the film, and not making fun of it. Extreme care was given not only to the jokes, but the look of the show. Lucas again was impressed with the Star Wars parody, as he told Family Guy creator Seth MacFarlane, Family Guy was the only show that he would ever TiVo. Well, Family Guy and Jackass. The show was so successful, a parody of The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi were made to kick off each of the following seasons.
It's
coming right for us! Let's move! Move!
Star Wars had gone from a movie most didn't believe could even make its money back, to a highly successful toy franchise, to copycats trying to take some of its success, to fans growing up and making their own Star Wars parody and fan films. But when did Star Wars become fully established as the king of pop culture?
Hey, did she say they just bought some stolen droids or something?
Yep. Damn shame. Damn shame.
HK-888.
They started selling tickets here at the Lowe's Astor Plaza at 8:30 this morning, and even at that early hour, the line was 5 football fields long. That's 5 across. If they would have been single file, they would have been standing all the way to New Jersey.
After walking out of the theater in 1983, after seeing the third Star Wars film, Return of the Jedi, you couldn't help but feel a little sad. This was it. The trilogy was complete. 6 years of Star Wars in our lives was no more. It was over.
This has left me practically utterly speechless, actually, but it was the best one ever.
The big surprise was seeing Darth Vader unveil himself to his son. It was very exciting.
It was a fantastic movie, but it was good. It was really, really good.
Sure, George Lucas kept talking about the prequel movies, and maybe he'll come back to Star Wars universe, but even Lucas was warning us it wouldn't be anytime soon. For the fans and George Lucas, Star Wars was over.
Lucas once said that he would have 6 more films after this one, although now we're not so sure. He may or he may not.
As Return of the Jedi was leaving theaters, you could already start to feel the end of the Star Wars fever. The Kenner Star Wars action figures, which was once the driving force of merchandise since 1978, was now being moved to the back of the toy store to make more room for He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. Most of the fans that grew up on the first film were now in their late teens and thinking of a lot more than movies.
I don't collect those figures anymore.
What happened?
I think we're a little old.
You're beyond that.
Yeah.
Around the same time, what little Star Wars we did have seemed to be aimed at a much younger market. Wicked the Ewok toys were starting to hit stores. The Ewoks even put on ice skates and went on tour. And the little hope fans had for a new Star Wars film, that would come to the small screen with 2 Ewok movies. 2 cartoons would also hit the small screen in 1985, one that focused on the Ewoks and another that focused on the droids. It was clear with the Ewok movies and the 2 cartoons that Star Wars was now being marketed to a much younger fan base. It was clear the Star Wars that the kids grew up on was ending. The first nail in the Star Wars coffin came in late 1985. Soon after the cancellation of the Star Wars cartoons, Kenner announced it would stop producing new Star Wars figures. With no new films in sight, and seeing a massive decline in sales, Kenner canceled the 2 lines based on the cartoons and its movie action figure line. Star Wars toys went from the front of the toy store display to the back of the store's clearance bin.
Star Wars toys. Right. In a couple of years, they'll be worth a lot of dough. Like a lot of other things.
You're buying them strictly as an investment?
Yes, definitely.
The Marvel Star Wars comic series had been able to stay afloat after the end of the trilogy. Although the comic sales were still strong, they did see somewhat of a hit, and the writers were being hand-tied by Lucas on what they could and couldn't do.
It was Marvel and not Lucasfilm that canceled the comic, and the sales were fine at the time I was on it.
Yeah.
But we did hit a point where we were feeling a little stymied and frustrated, and somebody said, oh, we need Joe and Cindy on other things anyway, so let's cancel that. And years after the movie, Star Wars had phenomenally good sales.
So Marvel ended the series with issue 107. At this time, it was almost impossible to find anything Star Wars related in a store. And with the end of the comic book series, Star Wars was now gone from comic book stores. The last holdout for the Star Wars fans. However, Star Wars wasn't completely dead.
How do you do, Harry? The passengers are boarding.
Prepare yourselves
Welcome aboard.
for the ultimate Disneyland thrill attraction from the imagination of Disney and George Lucas.
In 1987, Lucasfilm and Disney opened Star Tours, the Star Wars ride at Disneyland, and West End Games would release the Star Wars role-playing game. This was the 10th anniversary of Star Wars, but it went almost unnoticed, except for a Star Wars convention put on by the science fiction magazine Starlog. They would see many of the actors come out and meet fans. This was also the only public appearance of Star Trek creator Gene Roddenberry and George Lucas together on stage. Star Wars faded into the dark. As fast as it came into our lives, it was gone. Then, what seems to be out of nowhere, a small spark was lit in the Star Wars fanbase. In 1985, after hearing a rumor that George Lucas said there would be no more Star Wars movie, Bantam's Lou Aronoff, who was head of the science fiction label for the publishing company, was shocked to hear Lucas's comments. He hated the thought of no more Star Wars, for not knowing what would happen after the events of Return of the Jedi. So, he wrote a heartfelt letter to George Lucas, explaining that the story of Star Wars was too important to let go. He asked if they could write one good Star Wars novel a year, starting with a new trilogy. For over a year, Lou didn't hear anything back. But there was some talk going around Lucasfilm about a Star Wars novel, but George Lucas felt no one would buy him. But he finally agreed to let Bantam publish a Star Wars novel, with strict rules. The novel would have to take place 5 years after the last film. Events that took place before A New Hope would be untouchable, and no major character could be killed off, and no one dead could come back to life. In 1989, Lou Aronoff signed science fiction author Timothy Zahn to write the novel after he found out Zahn was a huge Star Wars fan. The novel was written, turned in, and Lou gave it the title Heir to the Empire. It was released on May 1st, 1991. A month later, Heir to the Empire will hit the #1 spot on the New York Times best-selling list for 1 week. However, it will stay on the charts for 19. The success of the Star Wars novel gave birth to the Star Wars EU, but it did a lot more than just that. It showed not only Lucas, but the world that Star Wars was still loved and the public wanted more. Bantam would go on to release more Star Wars books and kill their plan of one a year. In 1997 alone, they would release 22 Star Wars novels. Some would hit the top of the best-selling charts, and others would stay near the bottom. But when it came to the Star Wars EU, the Timothy Zahn novel wasn't the only Star Wars story being told in 1991. At the same time Lucas was working with Bantam on the novel, they were in talks with Dark Horse Comics to bring Star Wars back to the comic book stores. Although the series had limitations put on it, just as Zahn had, Lucas seemed to give the comic book series a little more playroom. For Heir to the Empire, Lucas acts from the first draft a clone of Obi-Wan Kenobi, saying it goes against his rule of no one coming back to life. However, the Dark Horse comic Dark Empire was allowed to bring back, as a clone, Emperor Palpatine. A choice that didn't sit well with Timothy Zahn. It destroyed the whole sacrifice of Darth Vader, Zahn said. It unravels the end of Return of the Jedi, he would go on to add. It seems Zahn wasn't a fan of the Dark Horse comic series. In his novel, Visions of the Future, Luke Skywalker talks with Mara Jade about the time he had to fight a clone of the Emperor. Mara Jade tells Luke that she doesn't even believe that was really a clone of the Emperor. Dark Empire was also a huge hit, again showing everyone that Star Wars was not dead. Not only was it being sold to novel book readers, it was also being sold to comic book readers. However, Star Wars was still being seen by many as a niche, a thing just for the geek culture, not really mainstream, not anymore. But it enforced to Lucas that maybe it was time to finally get around to making those prequels. Lucas was still thinking of returning to the Star Wars galaxy to complete his story, but he wasn't sure that he could do the story he wanted with the limited technology of the early 90s. That was until 1993, when he saw his friend Steven Spielberg's film Jurassic Park. It was his company, ILM, that helped bring the dinosaurs to life, and like anyone that saw the film, it left an impression on Lucas. With movies like The Abyss, Terminator 2, and Jurassic Park, Lucas knew without a doubt he could finally make the Star Wars movies he's always wanted. Seeing what the latest technology could do in film, and having fun on the making of the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, this lit a fire under Lucas to make movies again. On November 1st, 1994, Lucas started to write the first draft to Episode 1. However, there were still some that believed Star Wars had had its time, that it was a thing of the past. Sure, the ones that grew up on it loved it, But what about the kids? The ones that were not even alive when Star Wars was released in 1977. Lucas had to see if the kids of the 90s were into Star Wars and get them ready for more.
The Star Wars Power of the Force Collection. Darth Vader leads an evil empire towards universal domination.
Lucasfilm reached a deal in late 1994 with Kenner, now under Hasbro, to bring Star Wars action figures back to the toy store. If they could sell action figures to a movie not seen for over 10 years on the big screen, it would show to everyone that Star Wars was still as much alive in 1995 as it was in 1977. There had been hardly any Star Wars related merchandise in stores between 1985 and 1995. But Hasbro's market research found that there was a demand for Star Wars, and not just from the kids, but from a new group of buyers, ones with a lot more spending cash than kids. As the novel and comics of Star Wars was selling in the early 90s, there was also an underground market of Star Wars fans that most people were not even aware of. Kids that grew up on Star Wars were now in their early 20s, and they wanted Star Wars. Yard sales, flea markets, ads in newspapers. Star Wars fans were now going back, buying up old Star Wars action figures they had as kids or trying to complete their collection. An action figure that would have cost $2 in 1980 was now selling for a few $100s. The action figure collector market was born. Kenner had already seen the power of the adult collector market. When it released figures based on Batman the Animated Series, sales soared with the line, and much of it was being bought up by the adult collectors. If the adults were buying new toys, and they were paying hundreds of dollars for the old toys, Hasbro knew they would be beating down the door to buy new Star Wars figures. And they were right. In 1995, Kenner released Power of the Force, a new set of Star Wars figures. This time, a little bit more jacked up than the originals, but the fans didn't care. Kids and adults bought them up. If the success of the novel and the comic book wasn't enough to prove that Star Wars was still a hot item, the sale of the merchandise did. Lucas still needed to see how much of a Star Wars love was out there, and he also needed more money to use to start to film the prequels.
For an entire generation, people have experienced Star Wars the only way it's been possible, on the TV screen. But if you've only seen it this way, you haven't seen it at all.
So, for the 20th anniversary of Star Wars, Lucas released to theaters Star Wars, the Special Edition. Would people go out, pay money to see a movie that most of them had for years on home video? Would adding a few new scenes and updating some of the special effects bring out more than just the hardcore fans? On January 31st, Star Wars was released into theaters as crowds of Star Wars fans waited in line for hours or days. It brought in $34 million on opening night. It would go on to earn over $134 million during its run. And this was just episode 4. Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi would also be released weeks apart as a special edition and make close to the same amount of money that Star Wars did. If there was anyone still in doubt about Star Wars, this put an end to it. You could write off the success of the comics, the novels, the toys, as a niche group of buyers. But 3 films, over 15 years old, making more money than a lot of the new movies released that year, it was clear Star Wars was still alive, and fans were at a fever pitch for more. Three years later, Lucas would finally release the Star Wars prequel he had talked so much about. In 1999, The Phantom Menace was released with even more fanfare than the special edition. Fans camped out for months outside to make sure they got a good seat for the film. The Phantom Menace was a huge success, but it was a special edition in 1997 when Star Wars came of age. Before 1997, you could walk into a store and not see anything from Star Wars. Try that after the release of the special editions, and it was almost impossible. Even today, you probably will see something Star Wars related, no matter what type of store you walk into. In 1997, Star Wars returned to the public's attention, and not just the die-hard fans, and it's been there ever since. Even with its ups and downs, its highs and lows, its good times and bad times, even when there were a break between films, Star Wars, after 1997, never faded away, as it did for a little time after Return of the Jedi. For many of us fans, Star Wars had always been there. It was always on our mind, always within reach. But it was on January 31st, 1997, when Star Wars became fully established as the king of pop culture.
The Force will be with you, always.